Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about alveolar and systemic gas exchange. We're going to talk about a couple gas laws. The gas law that is discussing partial pressure gradients, and we're going to discuss the gas law that governs solubility of gases and fluids. And this is going to be very important because it's going to cover how do the gases enter our body, while some other gases simultaneously are escaping our body, and how do we transport these gases back and forth. Since our body is made primarily of water, gases' solubilities in water is going to be very important in how that's transported. And so we've already talked about Boyle's gas law in the previous section whenever we were talking about how our air is able to get brought in and escape our body, and this is air in general. Now we're going to go in and we're going to talk about specific gases that are in that air. And so Boyle's gas law is primarily about like physical gases, how it's able to enter and exit our body. And so first we need to define gas exchange. And so alveolar gas exchange and systemic gas exchange are two different types. In alveolar gas exchange, this is going to happen in our lungs. And in our lungs, O2 enters and CO2 leaves our lungs. And this is going to enter into our bloodstream versus enter into or leave our bloodstream or enter into the atmosphere. And systemic gas exchange is going to happen in our tissues. And in this case, oxygen is going to leave our bloodstream to go into our tissues, and CO2 is going to enter our bloodstream to escape or go back out. And so an important thing to remember here is that the tissue or the oxygen and carbon dioxide are always going to go down their concentration gradients. So gases move down concentration gradients. And whenever I say down concentration gradients, we're going to go in and we're going to define this term a little bit more in detail. And so I want y'all to think about sources. And so anytime we talk about a gradient, there's going to be a source and there's going to be like a destination. And so a source means this is where that gas comes from. And so, for example, oxygen. Oxygen has a source, and those are trees, right? And so trees produce oxygen. Oxygen diffuses away from that source. If it's at highest, it will be at highest concentration where it's produced. And so oxygen is going to diffuse all the way down to our lungs, and then all the way down to our tissues, which is the final destination for oxygen. And this is different for carbon dioxide. So now I'm going to erase this. Carbon dioxide is not produced by trees primarily. Now, carbon dioxide is produced by trees whenever trees are undergoing cellular respiration, for example, at night. But the main source for carbon dioxide is going to be our cells. And so cells are going to use oxygen as that electron carrier to try to get more energy or get more ATP. So CO2 is going to be produced by our cells. And so this is where CO2 is at its highest concentration. So it is going to then diffuse into our bloodstream, and then to our lungs, and then out into the atmosphere. So those trees can use the CO2 to help convert light energy into stored energy. And so it's going to be this same thing going back and forth. And so it's always important to remember where is the source of this gas, and that will help give you the idea for its pressure gradient, so where it's going to go. So within a gas, there's something called a total pressure and a partial pressure, and we're going to use Dalton's law to try to understand this. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring up a blank page here for y'all. Okay, so you can kind of think about our atmosphere as a big jar. And in this big jar, there are a bunch of different gases. And so we'll have like oxygen, for example. But oxygen isn't the only thing in our environment. We also have carbon dioxide. And we also have nitrogen. And we have things like methane, etc. There's a ton of different different types of gases that are in our environment, but they are all going to be kind of enclosed within our atmosphere. And so these are all the gases that make up our atmosphere. And so this is going to all lead to atmospheric pressure. And here at sea level, we are under 1 atmosphere of pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. And so this is an important number because this is the pressure of all of the gases all put together. Now, if you wanted to know what the percentage is, or how much each individual gas gave us as pressure, then we would go through and just simply look at the percentage of each of those different types of gases. So for example, nitrogen gas is about 78.6% of all of the pressure inside of, or all of the gases inside of the atmosphere. So if we wanted to know the pressure that nitrogen contributes, we would multiply 0.786 times 760, and we would get that to be 597. And this is in millimeters of mercury. So nitrogen alone contributes about almost 600 units of that pressure that makes up all of the entire atmosphere. And so oxygen and carbon dioxide both are at lower levels, but they're all going to contribute. So if we wanted to now apply this to some kind of hypothetical example, and so I'm going to use an example that has easier numbers to help you all understand a little bit better. So now we're going to take and we're going to narrow this jar down. We're not going to worry about this jar and all of the different gases that make up the gases in the environment. I'm just going to draw a couple gases here, and these gases will just be carbon dioxide and oxygen. So, and let's see, so for example, I'm just going to add some extra of each one. So if the total pressure in this jar that I just drew is equal to 100, and this jar is 30% carbon dioxide and 70% oxygen, then that means that the individual pressure provided by each of these gases, so carbon dioxide would produce 30 units of that pressure, and oxygen would produce 70 units of that pressure. And so all in all, in this jar right here, it is going to contain gases, but this gas is a mixture of gas. The total pressure is 100, and carbon dioxide is 30, and oxygen is 70 of that total pressure. And so this brings us to the next law, and this is Dalton's law. And Dalton's law is, it's simple, and we've already kind of covered this, but the sum of all pressures in a gas is the total pressure. So now I want to bring y'all to a different example. And so what I like to do in this other example is set up some examples, or set up some like hypothetical situations. So let's put in here a little room. And so we're going to make this a room with 2 sides and a sealed door in the middle. And so right in here, both sides of this room are completely sealed and airtight. So in one side, let's put in some gas. And so the total pressure in each side is going to be 100. And so this is just hypothetical. You won't find a room with 100 units of pressure, but in this room, we're going to have CO2 concentrations or percentages at 30%. We're going to have oxygen percentage at 70%. And on this other side of the room, let's flip it. So CO2 is at 70% and O2 is at 30%. So whenever you open this door or you remove this, these gases are going to diffuse. Now the total pressure is the same, so you're not going to feel like a big gust of wind, but what you will have happen is whenever you remove this, the gases are going to diffuse down their pressure gradients. So for example, CO2 is at higher pressure on one side of this room, so over the course of time, this CO2 is going to diffuse towards the area at lower concentration. And so eventually what will happen is this CO2 is going to equalize itself. And then the same thing is going to happen with oxygen. So the oxygen is going to diffuse down its pressure gradient. And then they will eventually equalize themselves. And so then you would have 2 rooms with equalized pressures. Now, in this example, these are closed rooms. And so there is no adding of gas anywhere else. Now, we know in real life we have trees, and trees are going to produce oxygen, and we have cells, and these cells are going to produce carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide is going to constantly be diffusing down its pressure gradient, and oxygen will be diffusing down its pressure gradient. And this is going to end up resulting in gas constantly moving as different regions in the environment are creating these pressure gradients. And so what these are called, these individual gradients within like the world, for example, like whenever we had it at 70 and 30, these are called partial pressure gradients. And an extension here of Dalton's law is that gases at different partial pressures will diffuse down their gradient regardless of whether or not there is a bulk flow of air moving back and forth. So kind of like how if you have like you drop liquid food coloring into a jar and you swirl up that jar, this food coloring is going to diffuse throughout the entire jar as you swirl it around. And this is going to end up resulting in a mixed solution of gas. Now in the real world, you know, everything's not mixed up and swirled around, so oxygen doesn't get universally distributed because we have things that are using oxygen, we have things that produce oxygen, and so this ends up creating a constant imbalance, and the oxygen and carbon dioxide are always going to diffuse down their partial pressure gradients. And so this is important because our lungs, and we have alveoli, and they kind of look like trees, just kind of upside down and inside of our body. And so in our bloodstream that's floating by, there is going to be blood cells, etc. So I'll try to draw y'all some blood cells. And there's going to be gases. And so the gases that are more abundant in our bloodstream entering our lungs is going to be CO2, and it is going to diffuse down its concentration gradient. And simultaneously, the oxygen-rich air that we just inhaled, oxygen is going to diffuse down its partial pressure gradient into our bloodstream. And so I'll erase the blood cells so y'all can see here a little bit better. And so all of the gases don't diffuse one direction. Carbon dioxide is always going to go down its pressure gradient into the alveoli, and oxygen always goes down its pressure gradient into the bloodstream. And so this would continue until it equalizes, but we constantly are circulating our blood and producing carbon dioxide and using oxygen, so it's never going to become equalized until we are dead, right? So as long as we are alive and pumping, there will always be a pressure gradient inside of our bloodstream to our alveoli and inside of our bloodstream to our tissues. Okay, so let's, I added too many blank slides, but y'all have this information. I talked about this with y'all. We established the partial pressure gradients. We talked about why this is important for our body and what happens inside of the alveoli and our tissues. We talked about this slide. And so this is going to bring us to our next gas law. And the next gas law that's important is called Henry's law. And Henry's law is going to describe how gases are able to be dissolved into liquids. And so there's a couple things that are dependent here, and that's pressure. And so you can see in different pressures, gases are dissolved in different levels. And so as you go at higher and higher altitudes, the pressure drops. And so less oxygen is going to be soluble inside of your bloodstream, and less carbon dioxide will be soluble inside of your bloodstream, etc. And this also is important for diving. So for example, as divers go down deep into the ocean, if they come up too quickly, some of that nitrogen gas that's very soluble in your fluids is going to end up popping out of fluids it's very soluble at high pressures, and so in the sea level, or under the sea, it's going to dissolve into your bloodstream. But as you rise up, it's going to start popping out, and it can form bubbles under your skin. And so in order to get those to go away, you'd have to go into a barometric chamber, and they'd have to pressure you, and then they'd have to slowly raise you back out, and it's quite a difficult process. So if you're familiar with something called the bends, that's that whenever you get it inside of in the ocean from rising up too quickly. And so every single gas has a different solubility coefficient, and the solubility coefficient is just going to describe how soluble that specific gas is in water. And I'm not going to go through and make you memorize solubility coefficients, but I do think it's important to understand what the solubility coefficients mean. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you all some values, some examples here. So if a gas has a high solubility coefficient, this means that it's going to be more soluble in water. And carbon dioxide has a solubility coefficient that's about 24 times greater than that of oxygen. So it's dissolved in water very easily. Whereas oxygen then is not as soluble in water. And nitrogen is about half as soluble as oxygen. So this is why nitrogen doesn't cause problems at sea level, but if you go under deep pressure and that gas gets dissolved in your bloodstream, if you rise up too quickly, it pops out inside of your underneath your skin, and so that's a big problem. So let's see where this ends up taking us. And so it talks about the different types of gases, and it talks about nitrogen. And compression sickness, which I briefly talked to y'all about. But what this brings us to now is a little bit about gas transport and gas exchange. And so hold on to that Henry's law, the thing about solubility coefficient, because it's going to pop up back here in just a second. So there's an image, and I kind of have already described this image to y'all, but now y'all can see some specific values. And so, for example, the percentage of oxygen, the partial pressures of oxygen, which is what PO2 and PCO2 means, is how much oxygen or carbon dioxide is in the environment. So in our alveoli, which is reflective, it's not the same, but reflective of the atmosphere, there's going to be more oxygen. And inside of my bloodstream, there's going to be less. And so you'll see as gas enters our alveoli from our blood, the PO2 is much lower than the PO2 inside of the alveoli, so oxygen is going to diffuse down its pressure gradient here, and carbon dioxide is going to diffuse down its pressure gradient into the alveoli, and so by the time it leaves, you will see it's roughly equivalent to that of the atmosphere. And that's because we're constantly refreshing the air in our alveoli. So whenever we refresh our air, we keep these numbers, the PO2 and PCO2 in my alveoli, roughly the same. It stays pretty much continuous, as long as I'm not holding my breath or hyperventilating myself or breathing too quickly. And so our lungs are very efficient at being able to diffuse a lot of air very quickly, because our lungs have a very large surface area and very minimal thickness. And so if you took out all of our the cells of my lungs and you laid them out, they would take up 70 square meters. So in order to give you an idea, if you took 1 yard, and because a meter is roughly equivalent to a yard. So if you took one of these, one square yard on a football field, so 3 feet from the edge of the football field from the out of bounds line, and you took this all the way down, it would go all the way to about the 70-yard line. And so that's how many or how much surface area you have inside of your 2 little tiny lungs, with all their lobes, etc. 70 square meters of surface area for gas exchange. And the reason why you can fit all that in there is because it's super thin, only half a micrometer, which is super, super tiny. And so our lungs are able to ventilate themselves more. So for example, whenever you exercise, you'll breathe quickly. You won't, or you'll slow themselves down whenever you're at rest. And this is just getting enough blood. You're controlling, or enough gas. You're controlling the amount of gas getting refreshed in your lungs to keep those PO2 and PCO2 levels roughly consistent. You can also control your blood supply here, and so if you send more blood to your lungs, then the PO2 levels in your lungs will drop, and that's because you're getting more blood into your bloodstream. And so you control these two things, or you balance these two things to make sure that PO2 and PCO2 levels stay stable in your body and in the environment, or in your lungs. And so gas exchange is going to occur as bronchioles, ventilation is going to occur as the bronchioles dilate, and also if you alter perfusion or the blood supply here to your alveoli, you're going to alter the amount of CO2 and PO2, or PCO2 and PO2 inside of your lungs by having more or less gas exchange occur with the bloodstream. And so that's what this image is going to help show. But these two things, ventilation is going to be measured and controlled, and perfusion to your lungs is going to be measured and controlled to make sure that you have enough gas in your lungs, enough oxygen, and enough carbon dioxide. And you're going to also control the blood supply so that we control how much is entering into your body. So, let's see. So I'm going to skip. So I'm going to skip this clinical view. The theme of this clinical view is don't smoke. So smoking can damage some of that surface area. So you won't have all 70 square meters. You'll have less. But now we're going to talk a little bit more about gas exchange and talk about how it's so efficient. So we're going to actually, we've already discussed this, how our lungs are able to be so efficient at exchanging gases. And so now we're going to go into our tissues. And so in our tissues, you will notice that the air that enters, and so you'll notice that, remember before it was 104 millimeters of mercury leaving our lungs, and here entering our systemic tissues it's a little bit less, and that's because of bronchial circulation. And so our bronchioles, which are the tubes that are sending gas or sending air down to our lungs, they have smooth muscle in it, and so they are going to rob that blood before it leaves of a little bit of its oxygen, and so that's enabled to nourish those tissues. So the blood entering our systemic capillaries is going to have a much higher level of oxygen and a lower level of CO2. And so as the blood passes, oxygen is going to enter into our tissues and CO2 is going to escape and enter into our bloodstream. It's the exact opposite of what happened in my alveoli. And this is, again, there's huge amounts of surface area that are going to help with this. You obviously have tons of tissues, tons of cells all producing carbon dioxide and using oxygen. So this is going to allow these gases to diffuse down their pressure gradients to their destination in order to make sure our cells are functioning properly. So I told you all to hang on to that little bit about gas laws, or Henry's gas law about solubility coefficients, because now we're going to get that brought back up in again. And so whenever we talk about gas transport, the solubility coefficient is very important. And so you will remember oxygen has a 24 times lower coefficient than carbon dioxide. And so this means that oxygen is not very soluble in fluids. But fluids are our way of getting oxygen from point A to point B, which are all of my tissues. And so our body has fixed this, or nature has fixed this. We have a special protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is what transports 98% of our oxygen from my lungs out to my tissues. And so what it does is it removes that from the gas, or from the fluid, so it takes that oxygen out of the water that makes up our bloodstream and attaches it to these molecules. And so that's how we can transport a lot of this gas. It's very simple with oxygen, but whenever we get into carbon dioxide, it's a little bit more difficult. So carbon dioxide transport is a little bit different than oxygen transport because it is more soluble in water. So carbon dioxide actually has three ways that it's transported throughout your bloodstream. About 7% of it is just going to be simply dissolved in your plasma as CO2. 23% of it is going to be attached to hemoglobin, and not the heme group like the oxygen is, but the globin part, or the protein part of the hemoglobin. And then the other 70% is going to get dissolved as bicarbonate, and we'll talk about this step here in a minute, or right here. So that 70% that's transported as bicarbonate, what it does is it enters into a chemical reaction. And so whenever carbon dioxide interacts with water, it is going to undergo some kind of reaction that ends up producing carbonic acid, which will dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And so this is what ends up happening. And so most of 70% of that carbon dioxide, whenever it interacts with water, it's going to end up undergoing this process, and it's going to get transported as bicarbonate ions. There's this little image that I've got for y'all that shows you the carbon dioxide entering in, and there is an enzyme that's needed for this called carbonic anhydrase, but this ends up resulting in bicarbonate ions entering into your cells. And so there's also something important that with this that can be observed, and that's that whenever the bicarbonate escapes your red blood cells, which is where this reaction occurs, because that's where the enzyme carbonic anhydrase is located, whenever this carbon dioxide leaves your red blood cells, in order to keep the balance the same, chlorine ions will shift into your blood cells. And so this is called the chloride shift, but it's just the movement of chlorine into your red blood cells and the movement of bicarbonate into your plasma or into your bloodstream. And so you'll notice whenever I drew this, I drew these double-headed arrows right here. And that's because this reaction is reversible. And so depending on how much carbon dioxide is present in your blood, this is going to go back and forth and back and forth. So in your systemic capillaries, whenever you have an abundance of carbon dioxide, you'll have a lot of this stuff entering. And so it's going to react with all of this water and end up resulting in more and more bicarbonate present inside of your systemic circulation, whereas in your pulmonary capillaries, the opposite happens. So as you're removing carbon dioxide, as you pull more and more carbon dioxide out, then you're going to have less interacting with water. So this reaction actually goes in the opposite direction. And so you will end up shifting towards carbon dioxide to keep the balance of carbon dioxide and bicarbonate stable. So bicarbonate will end up doing the opposite, and this is still going to use that enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Just it works differently depending on the levels of carbon dioxide present in surrounding areas. So in areas where there's a lot of carbon dioxide, you'll have more bicarbonate being produced, and in areas where there's very little carbon dioxide, you'll have less being produced, or actually some even being absorbed in to release some of that carbon dioxide. Another important thing here to note, and there's a video that I've added in. It was I think it was a video by that guy that talks really fast. But another very important molecule on this equation is this hydrogen ion. And so whenever you have a lot of carbon dioxide being introduced and the reaction shifts this way, you're going to produce a lot more bicarbonate, but you'll also produce a lot more hydrogen ions, and hydrogen ions are what makes solutions very acidic. Bicarbonate is a slight buffer, so it helps buffer this, but you'll have a lot of hydrogen ions being produced. And this is why whenever you hold your breath, or you have a lot of CO2 being accumulated in your body, you'll undergo something called respiratory acidosis, because all of these acids are going to get released into your bloodstream. And whenever you breathe very quickly, or you hyperventilate, you will undergo something called respiratory alkalosis. And that's as your bicarbonate is being shifted this direction, so towards carbon dioxide, it's going to combine with these acid molecules to get there. And so it removes those hydrogen ions. So a very common misconception that students have is that oxygen makes your body more alkaline and carbon dioxide makes your body more acidic, but that's actually not true. The truth is carbon dioxide makes your body more acidic, and less carbon dioxide will make your body shift more alkaline. So whenever you hyperventilate, it doesn't matter what the oxygen is doing, you're eliminating more carbon dioxide, and this is what makes your body more alkaline. The elimination of carbon dioxide, because whenever you eliminate carbon dioxide, you're taking some of those acid molecules out, and you're shifting that to produce more carbon dioxide. So hemoglobin is a very important molecule because it transports oxygen and it transports carbon dioxide, and it also has the ability to transport some excess hydrogen ions that are bound to the globin part of the protein as well. But whenever you have any of these molecules binding to the hemoglobin, it changes the shape of the hemoglobin molecule, which influences or affects how much can be transported. So, for example, whenever your oxygen or your hemoglobin is loaded with oxygen, it is not going to be able to transport as much carbon dioxide. And so whenever it's not fully loaded, it's going to be a slightly different shape, and it's going to carry off some of that carbon dioxide. So we're going to now talk about hemoglobin saturation curve. And what this talks about is just how much hemoglobin, or how much those 4 molecules of oxygen are bound to the hemoglobin at different PO2s. And so whenever your body is somewhere around 98% PO2, or no, I'm sorry, 104 PO2, which is what we have inside of our lungs, 104, and this is from that same value that we talked about before, you will see that the percent saturation is about 98%, which is also the amount of O2 carried by my red blood cells. So we'll look at this and see in your tissues. And so if y'all remember, what was the PO2 in your tissues? And that was around 40. So hopefully you were able to remember before I gave the answer up. But about 40 PO2, our red blood cells are going to have about 75% saturated. And so that means 3 of those 4 spots are going to have oxygen bound to that heme group. And so this is just a graph that is used to determine this. At very low PO2s, so as the PO2 gets lower and lower, your hemoglobin is going to hold on to less and less oxygen. And so this is important because in your body, in tissues that have a lower percentage of oxygen, so for example, whenever you're running, your legs might end up using more oxygen, and so the PO2 might drop below 40. Well, more hemoglobin is going to release that oxygen, or that oxygen is going to jump off of that hemoglobin at those lower levels. Whereas at the same time, if, say, you're running, your arms are not doing nearly as much activity, which they'll still be doing a good bit, but let's say the PO2 is 60 or 70 or something, then in this area, those hemoglobin is not going to release as much. And so this keeps oxygen kind of distributed as it's needed within your body. There are also some other things that can affect hemoglobin, such as the amount of oxygen in different environments. And so as you get higher and higher, there's a lower level of PO2, and so this means your tissues are going to get less oxygen than they would otherwise. And so your body is going to accommodate for this or account for this by producing more red blood cells. And so as you produce more red blood cells, then you'll have a greater oxygen carrying capacity. So this is the ability of your body to still hold on to 3 molecules of oxygen per hemoglobin molecule is acting as kind of like an oxygen reserve. And so this is the amount that you have extra oxygen. And this extra oxygen can be delivered if a tissue is under higher metabolic demands. And so I used an example of running, and your legs need more O2. Okay, and so you'll see, y'all can read through this, but it states kind of what we've already discussed about. There are 2 other things that can affect PO2 levels. And so I'm going to zoom in here so y'all can see this. But this is the same little PO2 chart that we saw before, but what is focused on here is temperature. So whenever temperature is hotter, so what we see here is as you get higher and higher temperatures, the curve shifts down a little bit lower, which means that there is actually less oxygen being bound to hemoglobin. So what this means is as a tissue, or the practical application for this is as the tissue warms up, for example, like when you're exercising, it's going to excite those oxygen molecules, and that oxygen jumps off of hemoglobin, which is good because that means that tissue then gets more oxygen. So higher temperature typically means higher metabolic rate, which means more oxygen is needed. Another application of this is in an increase in pH. And so as pH, is a decrease in pH, sorry, or an increase in acidity. An increase in acidity. So as tissues get more and more acidic, the same thing happens. The curve shifts downward, which means that there is more oxygen being released from that hemoglobin, or jumping off of that hemoglobin. And again, there's a practical application for this. So in tissues that are metabolizing more, they're going to produce more metabolic byproducts, and those products are acidic. And so as it produces more acids, it's going to need more oxygens. And so this is going to end up helping out those tissues that are undergoing more and more metabolic processes. So the Haldane effect is just a special name given for a conformational change. And what this means is a change in shape. And so I mentioned this to y'all before, but now we're giving it a specific name. And this is just going to affect the amount of oxygen that can be bound, or carbon dioxide that can be bound. So as more and more oxygen leaves those tissues, you can imagine what happens then is this is going to mean that there's a increase in carbon dioxide as more oxygen is being released. And it's not because there's more oxygen released there is carbon dioxide. It's because that tissue is using more oxygen. There's probably going to be more carbon dioxide as well. And so this is going to actually change the shape of hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin is going to be able to bind more carbon dioxide, which helps buffer or contain the pH of your bloodstream. So it helps protect you a little bit. So this figure summarizes all of this. And so we have up here Boyle's law. And so it's going to describe these two things. We see gas exchange going in opposite directions. And this was Dalton's law, the law of partial pressures that can explain why gases can diffuse down their partial pressure gradients. And then we also have in here gas transport. And so this gas transport was going to be influenced by Henry's law, the law of solubilities. And so we can see that with these two images. And then this down here is again Dalton's law whenever we talk about gas exchange with the tissues. So you'll have this good summary chart that kind of goes over all of those different topics all in one. And here is just some a table that y'all have I want to provide y'all so y'all can just see some basic imbalances that could happen and what could be causing those, and clinically when you might encounter this as nurses or doctors or physician's assistants. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is how our breathing rate is going to affect or help us maintain homeostasis. And so whenever you hyperventilate, and I've already kind of influenced or talked about this briefly, so we won't go through it in a whole lot of detail because y'all should have a foundation for this. But as your body is hyperventilating, you're going to be breathing quicker. And what happens whenever you breathe quicker is you're going to be exchanging more carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide levels are going to drop. And so this is going to mean that your body is going to lose carbon dioxide, which means your body is going to have a raise in pH. Your blood is going to become more alkaline. And this is because of the carbon dioxide. And sometimes you'll do this because you're at high altitude. So being at high altitude, your body has low O2 levels, and so you might breathe a little bit quicker to get more oxygen. Or you might do this because of anxiety. If you're panicked because of an A&P exam, you hyperventilate a little bit. Or you might do this voluntarily like we did in lab whenever you breathed into the bags. And so this is all just what can happen with hyperventilation. And so whenever you have low blood CO2 levels, this will cause vasoconstriction. CO2 is a vasoconstrictive chemical. Or a vasodilating chemical, sorry. And so if you have low levels, this will cause vasoconstriction. And so this could decrease oxygen delivery to the brain. It could make you faint. And it also can result in respiratory alkalosis because you will have those hydrogen ions shifting back from the hydrogen bicarbonate side of the equation to produce more CO2 to keep your body's CO2 levels balanced. And some symptoms could be like faint, dizziness, numbing. You could even actually really faint. So feeling faint means feeling lightheaded or dizzy. But fainting could also occur as a result of hyperventilation. Hypoventilation is the opposite. So this is breathing too slow. And so a cause of this could be like if you're choking, or if you have pneumonia and you can't exchange many gases, or if you have some damage to your brainstem, the part of your brain that has those respiratory centers that control your respiratory rates. And so whenever you have hypoventilation occurring, PO2 level drops, PCO2 level increases. Whenever you have an increase in CO2, this is going to result in a decrease in pH, or your body gets acidic. Whenever your body gets too acidic, this could cause issues with proteins present in your blood. It could cause them to denature. It could cause some severe issues. And so people who have hypoventilation concerns, if you're not getting enough oxygen, those are symptoms that would result from low oxygen levels, such as lethargic or sleepiness, because remember, oxygen is used to produce energy, so if you don't have as much of it, you could feel these symptoms if you have less. And if you have very prolonged hypoventilation, it could lead to loss of consciousness or even death. And so remember that as your body's acidity levels accumulate, or as there's more and more acidity, or a lower and lower pH, then this could result in denaturing of proteins and damage to tissues that could be irreparable. So a lot of students believe that during exercise, your body is going to end up accumulating a lot of CO2. But what actually happens is your CO2 levels stay stable. And this is because your heart is going to increase its amount that it's pumping. So you increase cardiac output. Remember, this was known as cardiac reserve. And so you'll also increase your respiratory rate. And this is going to both increase perfusion and ventilation to your lungs, allowing more gases to exchange. And this is going to happen to keep your body's CO2 levels and PO2 levels stable. And so whenever you exercise, they actually maintain the same. pH doesn't change much, with the exception of like the acidity that occurs. And this is due to the fact that your body is going to end up sensing the CO2 and the PO2 levels. And so there are some different types of receptors in your body. Chemoreceptors, and these are going to detect pH. And these will also detect carbon dioxide concentrations, and so this will tell your body when to speed up its respiratory rate. But you also have things called proprioceptors, which detect motion. And so whenever your body starts moving, it increases your respiratory rate to help your respiratory rate accommodate the raise in CO2 that's going to happen in your body. And also your brain just has higher level thinking. And so just thinking about exercising is going to raise your respiratory rate. And this is, again, your body's way of accommodating that increase in CO2 that's about to happen, and the decrease in O2 that's about to happen. So that's it for this chapter. So you'll have these videos to help finish up respiratory rate and those other gas laws, Dalton's gas law and Henry's gas law.